The wind moved like it had no master, lifting the dust in slow, curling shapes that rose and fell as if the earth itself were breathing. The corral creaked under the weight of restless hooves, each plank bleached bone pale by years of sun. The air was dry enough to split a man's lips, to make every breath taste of grit and heat. Somewhere, a fly buzzed in lazy circles, drawn to the salt on sweat-soaked skin. Men stood shoulder to shoulder, boots planted in the dirt, coins in their pockets, and laughter spilling from their mouths. Their voices carried the swagger of people certain the day would give them what they wanted. Horses flicked their tails in the corral, nostrils flaring, eyes rolling as the shouts of bidding cut across the yard. It was a market of muscle and speed, of sharp eyes weighing the worth of something before the dust even settled on its hide. She stood apart, though not far enough to be invisible. The shadow of the corral fence fell across her boots, cutting her in two, half in the light, half in the dark. Her hands were still, clasped together in front of her, as though she might keep herself from shaking if she held on tight enough. She was not there to watch. She was there because a man who shared her blood, though not her heart, had dragged her into the noise and dust for his own salvation. Her stepfather reeked faintly of whiskey even in the morning sun. His hat was pulled low, his voice loud, cutting through the auctioneer's calls whenever he saw a man with deep pockets pass by. He was already talking about the gelding in the pen, a bay with a good back and steady gait, but his pitch was different from the others. He was offering more than the horse. He was offering her, as if she were part of the leather bridle or the saddle straps. A cattleman with two bright boots and a voice like a cracked bell leaned on the fence, looking her over as though she were another piece of stock. His friends laughed at something he said, their words too far for her to hear, but the tone was easy enough to read. He puffed himself up, slapping the dust off his trousers, tossing glances at the crowd like a man who expected applause. His interest was shallow, the kind that would fade as soon as the price became real. Her stepfather's words hit her ears like a door slamming shut. Loud, final, trapping. She could feel the ground under her feet shifting, the way it does before a storm when the air turns heavy. And then she saw him, across the pen, leaning a shoulder against the far post, a man whose stillness made him stand apart from the restless shuffle of the others. His hat brim shadowed most of his face, but his eyes found her through the haze of dust. They didn't look away. Something broke loose inside her, a mix of fear and a wild, desperate courage that felt like it didn't belong to her at all. She stepped forward before she had time to doubt it, her voice carrying across the space between them, cutting cleaner than she thought possible. Don't buy the horse, buy me. I'll be yours forever. It wasn't flirtation. It wasn't a gamble. It was the truth, laid bare, without polish, without the protection of pride. The crowd went still for a moment, the auctioneer's chant faltering, eyes turning toward her like leaves caught in a sudden gust. The cattleman laughed, the kind of laugh meant to crush a person smaller than the sound. The man across the pen didn't move, didn't smile. His gaze was steady, not curious, but measuring, like a man considering whether the ground beneath his boots was solid enough to take another step. She felt herself held in that look, seen not as something for the taking, but as someone who had stood through storms and not broken. The bidding on the horse went on, though it felt miles away. In the end, he raised his hand, and the bay was his. No one noticed the way he walked to her stepfather afterward, the way his voice stayed low, the way a small, folded envelope passed from one hand to the other. No one heard the terms, but they saw her walk toward him when it was over, her stepfather turning away with a weight lifted from his shoulders. They left the yard together, the horse trailing behind, the crowd's noise already fading into the hum of the wind. She didn't speak, and neither did he. The dust rose behind them in long, slow plumes, swallowing the town until there was nothing left but open road ahead. She didn't know yet what this was, rescue, bargain, or something else entirely, but it felt like the first breath after years of holding it in. The house stood like it had been dropped alone in the middle of the prairie, miles of gold grass stretching in every direction until they met the pale sky. Smoke drifted thin from the chimney, carried off by a wind that never seemed to stop moving. The boards of the porch were worn smooth where boots had come and gone for years, but the rest of it felt untouched, as though time had passed around it, not through it. Inside, the air was still, carrying only the faint scent of coffee and pinewood ash. The table was old, its surface scarred with the marks of years of use. One plate sat in the center, one cup beside it, one fork glinting faintly in the dim light from the single window. It was a place made for one man's living, not for two. The walls were bare except for a rifle hung above the door and a coat hook that carried a single worn hat. He didn't say much as he let her in, just set the kettle on the stove and pushed a chair toward her. She sat stiffly, her hands in her lap, watching the way he moved, quiet, efficient, like a man used to the company of silence. The chair creaked as she leaned back. The floorboards gave a small groan under his weight when he crossed the room. The first days were all strange edges, sharp with the awkwardness of two lives brushing against each other for the first time. She rose early, unsure if she was meant to help or simply keep out of the way. He showed her the barn, the corral, the tools for mending fence wire. She burned the first batch of biscuits, dropped a bucket of water halfway back from the well, tangled the reins trying to saddle the bay he'd bought. Each mistake flushed her cheeks hot, but she started again each time, her hands steadier than her heart. In the quiet hours, he noticed her habits. How she would stand in the doorway at dawn, arms folded loosely, staring toward the far horizon. Her eyes didn't just look, they searched, as though for a rider who had yet to crest the distant ridge. Some mornings the light caught her hair in a way that made her look like she belonged to the land, and yet he could see she was still half somewhere else. The first person to break the solitude was an older woman from the neck spread over. She arrived with a pie wrapped in a cloth and a face lined with years of prairie wind. Her eyes flicked over the newcomer with quiet suspicion, her words polite but heavy with questions she didn't voice. She stayed long enough to drink coffee, then left with a glance at the man that said she'd be watching. A ranch hand stopped by a few days later, bringing nails for the corral repairs. He treated her with a kind sort of distance, nodding in greeting, keeping his talk short and careful. She didn't blame him. Out here, people kept to their own until they were sure what kind of trouble someone might carry with them. One evening, she found him in the main room wrestling with a broken chair leg. He had a strip of leather and a hammer, but no easy way to make it stay. She watched from the doorway as he muttered under his breath, the stubborn wood refusing to fit. Without meaning to, a laugh slipped from her lips, small, surprised, and soft, like it had been hiding for years. He looked up at her, not smiling exactly, but his eyes held something warmer than the fire between them. The weeks stretched on. Word traveled fast in the nearest town, and it wasn't long before whispers began. People spoke of the auction yard, of how she had stood there, of what she'd said. The story changed with each telling, and soon the cattleman who had once shown no interest seemed to have found a reason to care. His name floated on the wind that carried the gossip, reaching even her ears. One afternoon, while she was in town for flour and lamp oil, she heard his voice, sharp and carrying. He was talking to someone just outside the general store, his tone mocking, careless with the truth. She froze by the shelves, a tin of coffee in her hands, her heart sinking. Then another voice cut through, calm, steady, low. The rancher. She couldn't see him, but she could hear the weight in his words, the quiet certainty, as he told the cattleman to hold his tongue. He didn't shout, didn't threaten, just said enough to make the point clear. She stayed inside until their voices faded, her hands trembling slightly on the coffee tin. And when she stepped out into the light, she found herself looking toward the street where he'd gone, something in her chest shifting. She hadn't trusted a man's word in a long time, but maybe, just maybe, this one was different. The first hint of the storm came in the way the light shifted, gold giving way to gray as the sky thickened with low, heavy clouds. From the porch, the prairie looked bruised, the hills swallowing the sun in slow gulps. In the barn, a single lantern glowed against the growing dark, its light trembling with every push of the wind. Inside, the fire was steady, its crackle filling the space between them. He sat in his usual chair, boots planted, elbows on his knees, eyes fixed on the flames. She mended a torn sleeve at the table, her needle dipping in and out of a cloth like a heartbeat. The quiet had weight to it, the kind that doesn't ask for filling. After a long while he spoke, his voice low, like he was speaking to the fire more than to her. He told her about the night his brother died, a cattle raid gone wrong, the sound of gunfire swallowed by the dark, the silence after. How he had ridden back alone, the saddle beside him empty, the stars cold and sharp above his head. She set the needle down, the cloth limp in her lap. Her words came slower, but once they started, they didn't stop. She told him about her mother's passing when she was barely more than a girl, how the house had emptied of laughter in a single day, how she had learned quickly to keep her voice low and her head down, to survive the years with a man who valued whiskey more than anything that breathed. They didn't look at each other much while they spoke. It was easier to let the fire hold their stories, to let the crackle and pop carry away what they couldn't bear to keep. The next day, Trouble wore a familiar face. The cattleman rode in with a smile that didn't touch his eyes, his boots clean like he hadn't done a lick of work that day. He leaned on the corral rail, looking her over like a man sizing up something he already believed was his. His words were smooth on the surface, but the edges cut. Talk of how she'd be better off with a man who could give her more, how some debts didn't stay settled for long. She said nothing, but she felt the air around her tighten. By the week's end, the whispers in town had turned into something heavier. Her stepfather showed up again, stinking of drink and self-importance, mumbling about a fresh debt owed to the wrong sort of people. He didn't ask if she'd come. He told her she would. His eyes carried that dangerous mix of arrogance and desperation that made her skin prickle. The rancher was there, leaning against the hitch rail, his arms folded. He didn't raise his voice, didn't let the tension crack into anger. He spoke slow and even, the way a man does when he knows he's not the one who needs to prove his worth. He told them she wasn't theirs to take, that whatever claim they thought they had ended the day, she stepped onto his land. Her stepfather's bluster faltered, but he left with a look over his shoulder that promised he wasn't finished. The cattleman, too, carried that thin, dangerous smile as he rode away. That night, she found him in the barn, checking the horses as rain began to patter on the roof. The smell of damp earth rose in the air. She stepped close enough for her words to be heard over the rain. She told him she would rather die than go back to either of them. He didn't move for a moment, just let the silence between them settle. Then he looked at her, steady as ever, and said, "You're already home." She wanted to hold onto those words, keep them somewhere safe inside her. But when she lay in bed later, the night pressing in close, she couldn't sleep. Through the window, she saw lightning far off, flashing in jagged lines against the dark. The wind picked up, rattling the shutters. Somewhere out there, the storm was coming, rolling in not just from a sky, but from the past that refused to stay buried. The storm broke in the kind of violence that made the land feel alive and angry. Lightning ripped open the night, throwing the prairie into brief, blinding relief. Thunder rolled so close it seemed to shake the ground itself. The wind battered the barn doors until they clattered against their hinges, and the horses stamped restlessly, tossing their heads at every new burst of light. She was in the small room off the kitchen when the knock came, not a polite tap, but a pounding that rattled the frame. Before she could move, the door flew open, and her stepfather stood there, rainwater streaming off his hat. Behind him loomed the cattleman, grinning through the storm like he was exactly where he belonged. Her stepfather's hand clamped down on her arm before she could think to resist. His grip was wet and cold, his voice slurred but sharp with purpose. "Time to come home," he said, though the word didn't sound like it meant safety. The cattleman's eyes swept over her, lingering with ownership. The wind rushed in through the open door, carrying the rain with it, chilling her to the bone. She tried to pull back, but the stepfather shoved her toward the dark outside. Before she could cry out, the cattleman swung her up into the saddle of a waiting horse. His hand on her thigh was a weight she wanted gone more than the storm itself. They rode hard into the wind, the rain slashing sideways, stinging her face. Lightning flashed, and for a heartbeat she saw the ranch house shrinking in the distance. She clung to the saddle horn, her mind not on escape yet, but on enduring, waiting for the moment she could move without breaking herself in the fall. Behind them, the sound came, hoofbeats cutting through the storm. She twisted in the saddle, and through the sheets of rain she saw him. The rancher was bent low over his horse, driving forward like the night had given him a single task, and he'd see it done or die on the way. The cattleman cursed under his breath and spurred his mount faster, the stepfather shouting something lost to the wind. But the rancher gained on them, the distance closing until he was no longer just a shadow in the dark. Lightning struck again, close enough to make the horses shy. In that jagged light, she saw his face, set unyielding, eyes locked not on them, but on her. They reached a low stretch of land where the mud sucked at the horses' hooves. The cattleman wheeled around to face the rancher, rain plastering his hair to his skull. "She's mine," he barked, though his voice cracked like the thunder overhead. The rancher didn't draw a gun. He didn't raise his voice. "She was never yours," he said, and the words landed heavier than any bullet. The cattleman sneered. "You think she chose you?" "I don't think," the rancher said. "I know she will." That was her moment. She swung her leg over the saddle before the cattleman could grab her, hitting the ground hard enough for the mud to splash up her skirts. She didn't run blindly. She ran to him. The storm seemed to shove her forward, the rain pushing at her back until she reached him. When she grabbed his arm, he steadied her without a word. The cattleman sat frozen for a beat, his face caught between rage and disbelief. Then he spat into the mud, yanked his reins, and turned his horse away. The stepfather lingered only long enough to glance at her, but whatever claim he thought he had dissolved in the rain. He muttered something to the wind and followed the cattleman into the dark. The ride back was slow, the rain still fierce, but the danger behind them. She clung to the saddle, not because she was afraid of falling, but because the weight of what had just happened sat heavy and strange in her chest. By the time they reached the ranch, the worst of the storm was breaking. Inside, the fire burned low but steady. She stood dripping in the kitchen, watching the water run off her sleeves and onto the floor. "I meant it," she said finally, her voice raw from the cold. He looked at her, silent. "That first day," she went on, "when I said I'd be yours forever, it's not for survival anymore. It's because I'm home." Something in his eyes softened. Not a smile, not relief exactly, but something truer. He nodded once, as if that was all either of them needed. Morning came slow, the clouds stretched thin and pale over the prairie. The ground was dark and rich from the rain, the air washed clean. In the kitchen, steam curled from 2 mugs of coffee. The plates, 2 now, waited on the table. Outside, the wind had gentled, brushing through the wet grass. The fire in the hearth threw a warmth that seemed to push back at the memory of the night before. And if there was a truth to be found in it all, it was this: love worth keeping doesn't come from the ones who demand you stay, but from the ones who wait quietly, steady as the horizon, until the day you decide to stand beside them yourself.